Welcome to Ethan's Revenge Domain.
I was at 36,000 feet, somewhere over the Midwest, when everything I'd built for 11 years disappeared with one email. The notification lit up my phone at 2:47 p.m. Sender, Preston Whitmore, CEO. Subject: immediate termination of employment. No greeting, no preamble, just 4 sentences that landed like a blade. Effective immediately, your employment with Vertex Capital Partners is terminated. Your services are no longer required. All company accounts and access have been revoked. A final severance package will be forwarded under separate correspondence. I read it twice. The cabin around me hummed with the white noise of cruising altitude, business people typing on laptops. A couple watching a movie. 2 rows up, the flight attendant in the galley restocking pretzels. Nobody noticed that the man in 14C had just been erased. I opened my work email on instinct. Authentication failed. Your account has been disabled. Slack. Same message. CRM. Locked out. Internal file share. Access denied. They'd moved fast, surgical. Every digital thread that connected me to the company I'd helped build, severed while I was in the air with no way to respond, no way to call, no way to do anything but sit in a pressurized aluminum tube and watch my career evaporate at 500 miles per hour. I stared at the tray table in front of me. Then I did something Preston Whitmore never saw coming. I bought the in-flight Wi-Fi. To beg, not to send an angry email no one would read. I opened my personal contacts, scrolled to a name I hadn't called in 6 years and hit dial. It rang 3 times. Then a voice I knew too well answered, cautious but curious. Marcus Chen. Marcus, I said, keeping my voice low. It's Stephen Cross. Pause. I could hear noise in the background, office chatter, someone laughing. Stephen, he said slowly. Been a long time. What's the occasion? I just got fired, I said, while on a plane. No warning, and I'm guessing you're about to find out why very soon. Another pause, longer this time. Keep talking. I was in Toronto closing a deal. $3.4 billion acquisition. Energy infrastructure portfolio, 6 operating assets, projected IRR north of 18%. The seller trusts me personally, insisted I be on point for the entire negotiation. I got them to yes. Signed term sheet in my bag. Due diligence is clean. This thing is bulletproof. And you're telling me this why? Marcus asked. Because Vertex just cut me loose mid-flight, which means Preston either has no idea what he just did or he's planning to close it without me and doesn't care that the counterparty made it very clear they'll walk if I'm not involved. Marcus was quiet. I could almost hear him thinking. What are you proposing? He asked. I land in 40 minutes, I said. By the time I walk out of the terminal, I'll have documentation showing I had the relationship, I sourced the deal, and I can move it. If you're interested, Silvercrest can step in as buyer. Vertex loses the transaction entirely. You gain the deal of the year. You're serious. Marcus, Vertex just fired the guy who brought them a 9-figure exit on this alone. I'm not being vindictive. I'm being practical. The deal goes where I go, and right now, I don't work for anybody. He exhaled, slow and controlled. Send me what you have. If it checks out, we'll talk the second you're on the ground. You'll have it in 10 minutes, I said. I hung up. Then I opened my personal laptop, the one they couldn't lock me out of, and started pulling every document I'd kept in my own cloud storage. Not stolen, not proprietary, just copies of my own work, client correspondence, deal memos I'd authored, market analysis I'd personally compiled. Everything I needed to prove one simple fact. The deal Preston thought he owned wasn't Vertex's. It was mine. And by the time that plane touched down at O'Hare, the most lucrative transaction in Vertex Capital's pipeline was already gone. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up and show you exactly how an 11-year veteran dealmaker, one arrogant new CEO, and a termination email sent at 36,000 feet turned into the biggest deal theft in private equity history, and why the people who thought you could replace relationships with a corporate logo learned a very expensive lesson about who actually owns trust. If you've ever been fired while you were in the middle of doing your job at the highest level, or if you've watched someone take credit for work you brought in and act like you were disposable, you already know the feeling I had in that moment. Hit that subscribe button, because this story is about what happens when companies forget that clients don't sign with firms. They sign with people. And when you discard that person at 36,000 feet, sometimes they land with all the leverage you thought you controlled. My name is Stephen Cross. I'm 43 years old. I don't come from money. I don't have an MBA from a school that opens doors just because you walked through it. What I have is this: 11 years of building relationships in one of the least forgiving industries in finance, a reputation for closing deals other people couldn't, and a Rolodex that, as it turned out, was worth more than the firm that thought they owned it. Before I joined Vertex Capital Partners, I spent 6 years at a mid-tier private equity shop that specialized in distressed asset acquisitions. It was brutal work, unglamorous, high pressure, full of deals that looked great on paper until you found out why the previous 3 buyers had walked away. I learned 2 lessons there that shaped everything that came after. Lesson 1: people do deals with people they trust. Not brands, not pitch decks, people. Lesson 2: if you can't execute when it gets messy, your reputation dies faster than the deal does. I got good at the messy part. When a seller's financials didn't reconcile, I dug in until I understood why. When a regulatory issue surfaced 3 weeks before close, I didn't panic. I found the specialist who could solve it. When a key stakeholder had cold feet, I got on a plane, sat across from them, and listened until I understood what they actually needed to hear. Deals didn't close because of spreadsheets. They closed because someone on the other side believed you'd do what you said you would. By year 6 at that firm, I'd built a small but valuable network. CFOs at energy companies, family office managers, independent sponsors who worked outside the typical institutional channels. That's when Vertex came calling. Vertex Capital Partners wasn't a giant, but they had ambition and capital. When I interviewed with the founding partner, a man named Gerald Frost, he asked me one question that told me everything I needed to know about whether I'd fit. What's the hardest deal you ever closed, and why did it almost fall apart? I told him about an industrial services acquisition where the founder had been burned by a previous buyer who'd gutted the management team post-close. He didn't trust anyone in finance anymore. It took me 4 months of dinners, plant tour, and conversations with his leadership team before he believed we'd actually honor what we promised. Gerald nodded slowly. Most people would have walked, he said. They would have said he was difficult and moved on. He wasn't difficult, I replied. He was protecting something he'd built. That's not unreasonable, Gerald smiled. That's why I want you here, he said. We win because we're patient and we keep our word. If you believe in that, you'll do well here. I joined Vertex 6 weeks later, and for the first 9 years, Gerald was right. At Vertex, my role was officially Managing Director, Energy and Infrastructure. In practice, it meant sourcing acquisition opportunities in sectors nobody else wanted to touch, building relationships with sellers who didn't trust typical PE buyers, structuring deals where the complexity scared off competitors, executing on timelines that required working weekends, holidays, and time zones that guaranteed 2 a.m. calls I didn't mind. Because the work was respected. Gerald valued the relationships I built. He backed me when deals took longer than the investment committee wanted. He understood that trust couldn't be rushed. In my first 3 years, I closed 4 deals. Total deployed capital, $890 million. Aggregate return, 2.7x MOIC. By year 6, I'd brought in 2 more. Both outperformed projections. My carry profit share on successful exits was meaningful, not life-changing yet, but real. More importantly, my reputation in the market was growing. Sellers started reaching out directly. Brokers knew I could close difficult transactions. Other PE firms occasionally asked if I'd look at something they'd passed on, just to get a second opinion. That kind of credibility takes years to build, and about 30 seconds to destroy if someone doesn't understand what they're messing with. The shift started 2 years ago when Gerald announced he was stepping back. Not retiring outright, just transitioning to chairman and handing CEO duties to someone with fresh energy and growth vision. That someone was Preston Whitmore. Preston was 41. Former McKinsey, former bulge bracket investment banking, former everything that looked good in a deck but didn't necessarily translate to running a relationship-driven business. His first all-hands presentation had a lot of phrases like operational leverage, scaling our platform, institutionalizing our process. What it didn't have was a lot of acknowledgement that Vertex's edge had always been the opposite of institutional process. We won because we moved fast, stayed flexible, and earned trust one conversation at a time. Preston wanted org charts, approval hierarchies, stage gate processes. Within 6 months, he'd hired a chief operating officer who'd never worked in PE, launched a rebrand that cost $400K and looked like every other firm's website, implemented a CRM requirement that treated client relationships like sales leads. I ignored most of it. I kept working the way I always had. Calls, flights, dinners, site visits, long emails at midnight because someone on the other side of a deal needed reassurance. It worked. Deals kept closing. But I started noticing something. In Preston's quarterly reviews, my deals were presented as firm wins, not Stevens sourcing. When I brought a new opportunity to investment committee, the follow-up memo credited business development efforts, not the 3 months I'd spent building rapport with a skittish seller. The language was shifting, from "we're lucky Steven has these relationships" to "the firm has a strong pipeline." I mentioned it to Gerald once, casually. "Preston's trying to make us look bigger than we are," he said. "Don't take it personally." But it wasn't about ego, it was about ownership. Because the moment a CEO starts pretending that relationships belong to a logo instead of the person who built them, you're no longer seen as essential. You're seen as replaceable. The Toronto deal started 8 months ago with a cold email, not to Vertex, to me, personally. Subject: confidential inquiry, energy infrastructure divestiture. It was from a man named Robert Callahan, CFO of a Canadian holding company that owned a portfolio of renewable and traditional energy assets across Ontario and Quebec. The assets were good, stable cash flow, contracted revenue streams, well-maintained infrastructure, book value in the $3 billion range. But there was a problem. Robert's board had been burned before. 3 years earlier, they'd sold a similar portfolio to a PE firm that promised operational continuity, then gutted management and flipped the assets in 18 months. Employees lost jobs. Communities lost trust. The board swore they'd never work with private equity again unless they found someone who operated differently. Robert had heard my name from a mutual contact who'd worked with me on a prior deal. His email was careful, polite, tentative. "I'm not sure if you're the right fit, but I'd like to have a conversation, off the record, no obligations." I called him the next day. We talked for 90 minutes. He wasn't coy. He told me exactly what had gone wrong before, what his board was afraid of, what they needed to hear before they'd even consider engaging again. I didn't pitch. I listened. At the end, I said, "If you're willing to take a meeting, I'll fly to Toronto. You can ask me anything. If you don't feel comfortable after that, we part as friends and you don't owe me anything." "When can you come?" he asked. "Thursday," I said. I went. We met in a quiet conference room at their headquarters, just Robert and 2 board members. They asked hard questions. How do you treat legacy management teams? What happens to employees post-acquisition? Do you flip assets or hold them? How do you actually make decisions, not what's in the deck, but in practice? I answered honestly. Some of my answers they liked. Some they pushed back on, but by the end of the meeting something had shifted. One of the board members, a woman named Diane, leaned back and said, "You're different from the last group. I don't know if that's enough, but it's a start." That was 8 months ago. Since then, I'd flown to Toronto 11 times. I met with operations teams. I toured facilities. I sat through financial reviews. I answered the same questions multiple times because trust doesn't build in one conversation. Slowly, Robert and his board started to believe that I meant what I said. 2 months ago, they agreed to exclusive negotiations. Last month, we signed a term sheet. Total transaction value, $3.4 billion. IRR projection, 18-22%. Arguably the largest and cleanest deal Vertex had ever touched. Preston was thrilled. In an email to the partnership, he wrote, "This transaction represents a major milestone for the firm. Congratulations to the entire BD team for their efforts in securing this opportunity. There was no BD team. It was me, for 8 months, alone. But I didn't correct him. I just kept working. The morning I flew to Toronto for what was supposed to be the final negotiation session, Preston sent me a calendar invite. Brief call post-close planning scheduled for 2 days after I returned. I accepted without thinking much of it. The meetings in Toronto went well. We ironed out the last few commercial points. Robert and I shook hands across the table. "I'm glad we're doing this with you," he said. "Not your firm, you." I filed that sentence away, not because it surprised me, because I knew how important it was. I boarded my flight back to Chicago at 1:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. The plane pushed back on time. Normal climb, normal cruise. At 2:47 p.m. my phone buzzed. One email, Preston Whitmore. I've already told you what it said. What I haven't told you is what happened next. After I hung up with Marcus Chen and sent him the initial deal summary, I sat back and stared out the window at clouds that looked like they were standing still. I wasn't angry. I was calm. Because I'd been here before, not exactly this situation, but close enough. I knew what it felt like to be treated like a line item on a spreadsheet. I knew what it looked like when executives convinced themselves that a person's value could be transferred to a brand with the right press release and a new business card. They were wrong, and I had exactly 90 minutes before landing to prove it. The files I sent Marcus included a summary of the transaction structure, redacted financials, public filings, nothing proprietary, email threads showing my direct relationship with Robert, notes from every meeting I'd had in Toronto kept in my personal files, a one-page brief on why the seller would walk if I wasn't involved. Marcus called me back 20 minutes later. "This is real," he said. "No games." "No games," I replied. "They fired me because Preston doesn't understand that the client relationship isn't transferable. If Vertex tries to close without me, Robert will kill the deal. And if Silvercrest steps in with you on point, I'll call him before I leave the airport," I said. "If he's comfortable, you'll have an executed LOI by end of week." "What do you want?" Marcus asked. "Normal carry structure, clean credit for sourcing, and public acknowledgement that I brought this so my reputation stays intact." "Done," he said. "Send me the full book when you land." The plane started its descent. By the time we touched down at O'Hare, I drafted the email to Robert. I sent it from the gate while people were still pulling bags from the overhead bins. "Robert, I need to inform you of a development. As of this afternoon, I'm no longer with Vertex Capital. This was not my choice and happened without warning. I want to be transparent with you because I know how important trust is in this process. I'm currently in discussions with Silvercrest Partners, a firm I've worked with in the past. They have the capital, the operational approach, and the commitment to honor everything we've discussed. If you're open to it, I'd like to introduce you to their team and continue this transaction under a structure that reflects the relationship we've built. If you'd rather pause or walk away entirely, I'll understand. You hired me, not a logo, and I won't ask you to move forward with anyone you're not comfortable with. Let me know what you'd like to do." "Steven," I hit send. Then I walked out of the terminal and into the cold Chicago evening. My phone rang before I reached the parking garage. "Robert." "Steven, what the hell happened?" he asked. "I got fired mid-flight," I said. "No explanation, just an email cutting off my access." He swore quietly. "I told you from day one," he said. "We're doing this deal with you, not Vertex. If you're out, we're out." "I appreciate that," I said, "but I don't want to leave you in the lurch. I'm talking with Silvercrest. They're legitimate. If you're willing, I'll facilitate an introduction and we can pick up where we left off." Pause. "You vouch for them?" he asked. "I do." "Then let's talk tomorrow," he said. "Send me what you need me to review." "Will do." I hung up. Then I forwarded the conversation summary to Marcus with a note. "He's in. Let's move." 72 hours later, Silvercrest had an executed letter of intent with Robert's company, not Vertex, Silvercrest. The deal that Preston thought was locked in because it was in his pipeline tracker and on his quarterly projections was gone, moved to a competitor, by the guy he'd fired from a plane. The fallout wasn't immediate. For about a week I heard nothing from Vertex. Then I got a call from Gerald. "Steven," he said, voice careful, "we need to talk." "About what?" "You know what? The Toronto deal. Preston's saying you stole it." I didn't steal anything, I replied. I built a relationship over 8 months. Vertex fired me while I was traveling. The client chose to move the deal to a firm where I'm actually employed. That's not theft, that's reality, Gerald sighed. He wants to pursue legal action. On what grounds? I asked. That I took client relationships I personally sourced and personally managed. That a client chose to follow me instead of staying with a firm that fired the only person they trusted. Silence. You could have given us a chance to fix this, Gerald said quietly. You could have not fired me on a plane, I replied. I'm not the one who made this adversarial. Preston didn't think the relationship was personal. Then Preston is learning an expensive lesson. Gerald didn't argue. I wish this had gone differently, he said. So do I, he hung up. Vertex did try to fight it. They sent a cease and desist letter claiming I'd violated non-solicit agreements and misappropriated confidential information. My attorney responded with a breakdown. The relationship predated any formal engagement with Vertex. I'd sourced the deal independently through my personal network. All materials I'd used were either public or my own work. Product. The client had made a voluntary choice to continue with me. Not Vertex. Non-solicits don't prevent clients from choosing to follow a trusted advisor. Vertex's counsel pushed back. Then Robert's company issued a public statement. Our decision to transition this transaction to Silvercrest Partners was based on our long-standing relationship with Stephen Cross and our confidence in his ability to execute. We have no ongoing relationship with Vertex Capital Partners. That killed the legal posturing. Because at the end of the day, you can't force a client to stay with a firm they don't want to work with, especially when they're writing a $3.4 billion check. The deal closed 4 months later, smooth, clean, exactly as structured. Robert sent me a handwritten note afterward. Thank you for not making us regret trusting someone in private equity again. This was the right outcome. Silvercrest gave me full credit publicly. In their press release announcing the transaction, my name appeared in the second paragraph. My carry on the deal, 8 figures. More than I'd made in my entire 11 years at Vertex. 6 months after the deal closed, I was in New York for an industry conference. I ran into Preston in the lobby bar of the hotel. He saw me. For a moment, I thought he might turn around and leave. Instead, he walked over. Stephen, he said. Preston, awkward silence. Can I buy you a drink, he asked. I almost said no, but curiosity won, sure. We sat at a corner table. He ordered scotch. I ordered water. I owe you an apology, he said after the drinks arrived. I waited. I made a mistake, he continued. I thought the deal belonged to the firm. I didn't understand how much of it was personal. By the time I realized, it was too late. You fired me on a plane, I said, while I was closing your biggest transaction. I know. Why? He looked at his glass. The board was pushing me to cut costs, he said. Your comp was flagged as high relative to internal benchmarks. I thought we could close the Toronto deal with someone cheaper and you just move on to the next thing. You thought relationships were interchangeable, I said. I did, he admitted. I was wrong. I leaned back. What happened after? I asked. We had a bad year, he said. Lost 2 other deals because the clients wanted people who weren't there anymore. Our returns dropped. The board asked me to step down. And I resigned last month. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that. Just tired recognition that some lessons cost more than others. Sorry it went that way, I said. He looked surprised. You mean that? I do, I said. I didn't want to hurt Vertex. I just wasn't going to let you erase my work. He nodded slowly. For what it's worth, he said, Gerald told me I should have listened to him about you. He said you were the kind of person who makes a firm, not the other way around. He was right, I said. Preston finished his drink and stood up. I hope your next thing goes better, I said. Thanks, he replied. He walked away. I never saw him again. I stayed at Silvercrest for another 2 years. We closed 3 more deals in the energy space, all sourced through relationships I'd built over the previous decade. Then I did something I'd been thinking about for a long time. I left. Not because Silvercrest was bad, because I realized I didn't need a platform anymore. The relationships were mine. The reputation was mine. The ability to evaluate, structure, and close transactions, that was mine. So I started my own advisory firm, small, lean, no office. No brand spend, just me, a strong network, and a track record that spoke for itself. I advised on 6 transactions in my first year as an independent. Total deal value $8.2 billion. My fees were structured as success-based. I made more than I ever had working for someone else. And every time a client signed, it was because they trusted me personally. Not a logo, not a pitch deck, me. 3 years after that flight where I got fired at 36,000 feet, I was invited to speak at a private equity conference. The topic, building client relationships in a transactional industry. I told the Toronto story, not to brag, to make a point. When I finished, someone in the audience raised their hand. What would you say to a young dealmaker who's worried their firm will take credit for their work? I thought about it. Document everything, I said. Keep your own records of who you talked to when and what you promised, not because you're planning to leave, because if you ever have to leave, you need to be able to prove what's yours. And if the firm says that violates confidentiality, there's a difference between stealing proprietary information and keeping proof of your own work, I said. Know that line. Stay on the right side of it. But don't let anyone gaslight you into thinking that a relationship you built over months or years somehow belongs to a letterhead. The room was quiet. Another hand went up. Do you regret how it went down with Vertex? No, I said. I regret that it had to go down at all, but once it did, I'm glad I didn't pretend the deal was theirs when it wasn't. If you're still with me, here's the part that's actually about you. Not about private equity, not about billion-dollar deals, about power. The kind of power that lives in relationships, in trust, in the space between a client saying yes and the contract getting signed. That power doesn't belong to the logo on your business card. It belongs to you. And the moment someone tries to take that away, whether by firing you mid-flight or cutting you out of credit or telling you that your work is the firm's pipeline, you have a choice. You can accept it or you can prove them wrong, not with anger, not with sabotage, with facts, with documentation. With the relationships that chose you, not the entity that happened to be paying your salary at the time. Preston learned a $3.4 billion lesson about what happens when you confuse ownership of a person's seat with ownership of their network. He learned it because I was 36,000 feet in the air with nothing to lose and 90 minutes to make a phone call. But here's the truth. I didn't win because I was smarter. I won because I'd spent 11 years treating relationships like they mattered more than quarterly projections. And when the choice came, stay with the firm or stay with the person, the client chose the person. Every single time. So if you're reading this and you're the one doing the work that actually brings in the deals, builds the trust, keeps the clients coming back, document it, protect it. And remember, the day someone tries to cut your access while you're in the air, the only thing that matters is whether the people on the other end of the deal know your name, or just the logo. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next one. CEO fired me at 36,000 feet. I called rival, sold 3.4B deal before landing.